These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. This is the Piper Alpha platform in the North Sea in 1988, when a gas leak and fire changed offshore safety forever. The lessons from this night created strict new rules for rigs, from valve checks to escape plans. Henry Ford's moving line, first used in 1913, cut Model T build time from 12 hours to 93 minutes. By 1927, Detroit had turned out 15 million Model T cars, with $5 a day pay for work done one simple step at a time. This is the Bola cyclone of 1970, when a 10-meter surge swept across the Ganges Delta and reshaped whole islands overnight. Its aftermath drove one of the world's largest warning and shelter programs. At Senghenyd in Wales in 1913, a methane explosion deep underground caused Britain's worst coal mine disaster, with hundreds lost as rescuers worked by lamplight. The shock of this day drove new safety rules for gas checks, airflow. This is Johnstown after the South Fork Dam failed on May 31, 1889, sending a wall of water across the town in about 10 minutes. The surge raced like a fast train and helped start new dam safety rules. Loggers pose with a giant sequoia in California in 1905, about 4 meters wide and 20 meters long, older than 3,000 years. Images like this fueled respect for ancient trees and helped create protected parks that guard the last groves today. An Arctic team in 1937 gets a close visit from 5 polar bears at their winter camp on Rudolph Island. This animal can smell food from over 1 kilometer away and can stand taller than 3 meters when on hind legs. Workers build the Hindenburg airship in Germany in 1936, the largest flying machine in history at 245 meters long. Its light frame held huge gas cells and a luxury cabin, and within a year, its dramatic end would close the era of giant airships. A German U-boat meets a depth charge burst in the Atlantic in 1944. Radar, sonar, and code-breaking flipped the sea war as pressure waves from these weapons could crack steel hulls and shield the lifeline convoys. In 1987, a small spark under a wooden escalator at King's Cross grew into a fast fire that raced up the tunnel. The event changed subway rules worldwide, adding smoke detectors, sprinklers, and a full ban on smoking. This is the Baker test at Bikini Atoll in 1946, a 21-kiloton blast that drove a water column about 1,800 meters high. The trial turned a fleet of old ships into instruments for study. On Easter Island in 1886, hundreds of islanders showed how a moai could walk upright using 3 ropes and a careful rocking motion. Tilting the statue from side to side moved it about 1 foot each step, a clue to how 887 statues, some 82 tons, reached the coast. Egyptian workers pulled a wooden sled with a 70 tons granite block, while one man poured water so the sand grains would stick. Modern tests show a little water, about 2 to 5% by weight, can cut the pull by half. In 1859, Charles Blondin crossed Niagara Falls on a 7.5-centimeter rope, 50 meters high, while carrying his manager, Harry Colcord, on his back. He later did return walks blindfolded and on stilts. In 1933, in the Gulf of Mexico, a giant ocean manta with a wingspan about 7 meters dwarfs the boat. This gentle filter feeder can reach 9 meters across and 3 tons, and today it is protected because it grows slowly and has very few young. In 1920, SS Japan, women of Koga-ryu drill silent skills with fans, hairpins, and stars in a wooden hall. Kunoichi were real agents who used disguise and small tools to gather secrets and slip past guards. In 1942, a crew readies the 800mm railway gun Schwerer Gustav, a steel giant of about 1,350 tons. It could send 7-ton shells nearly 50 kilometers, built by Krupp for siege work but famous for being slow and costly to use. At Kawah Ijen in Indonesia, miners carry 70 to 80 kilograms of bright sulfur up a steep volcano twice a day. They work beside a turquoise lake with acidity near zero and vents that burn blue at night, a rare sight on Earth. Pearl divers in the Persian Gulf once plunged 12 to 15 meters on one breath, using a stone weight to drop fast and a basket for shells. Many made 40 to 60 dives a day for months, until cultured pearls and oil ended the trade by the late 1930s. On Murano in Venice in 1897, glassmasters shaped glowing glass at about 1200 degrees Celsius while turning a long pipe to hold the form. Their crystal-clear cristallo came from closely guarded methods kept on the island for centuries. On the Altai steppe in 1920, a Kazakh eagle hunter rides with a trained golden eagle on his arm. These birds can see a fox from 2 kilometers away and often return to the wild after years of partnership. In 1912, a rubber tapper in the Amazon cuts a shallow V on a hevea tree to guide white latex into a small cup. Smoke curing turns the sap into strong rubber, and the boom faded when seeds sent to Asia created huge plantations that outmade the forest. Sherpa porters haul 30 to 40 kilogram loads through the Khumbu icefall at nearly 6,000 meters, a moving maze that shifts about 1 meter each day. Their work carried 7 tons of gear for the 1953 climb, when Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary reached the top of Everest for the first time. Japan's Ama Sea women dive on one breath to 10 to 25 meters, often making 60 to 100 cold water dives in a day. Many keep working into old age, and in 2023, the tradition was recognized as cultural heritage. A blue whale about 25 meters long is hauled up at a Norwegian station in 1905 during the peak of industrial whaling. The species neared the edge by the 1960s, and strict bans now guide a slow recovery. Built in 1923 as a real estate ad, the Hollywoodland letters stood 15 meters tall and glowed with 4,000 bulbs on Mount Lee. Meant to last a year, the sign survived storms and rebuilds. Drop the word land. A 27-ton dynamite shot lifts rock skyward at the Culebra Cut in October 1913, carving a path through the Continental Divide for the Panama Canal. After doctors beat yellow fever and malaria, steam drills and giant shovels moved 75 million cubic meters of earth to finish the waterway. In 1885, workers built the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, the first true skyscraper, using a steel frame so the walls did not carry the weight. This idea let cities rise to the sky, leading to towers like the Empire State Building within 50 years. On December 17, 1903 at Kitty Hawk, Orville Wright lifted the flyer about 3 meters and stayed in the air for 12 seconds, moving 36 meters. 4 flights that day proved controlled flight. In 1890, a smith in a Tatara forge folds tamahagane again and again, building tens of thousands of thin layers for a long nodachi. Heat, clay, and steady hammer blows over 6 months, leave a shimmering hamen and a balance that feels almost alive. In 1907 at the Dar Mine in Pennsylvania, miners lower a fallen coworker into a resting place deep underground after a blast. The sorrow of that winter pushed the nation to create federal mine safety rules in 1910 that still protect workers today. Workers set the 8-ton head of the Statue of Liberty onto the body on Bedloes Island in 1886, finishing a 46-meter figure made of 300 copper panels, only 2.4 millimeters thick, over an iron frame by Gustave Eiffel. Tuareg traders move about 40 tons of salt on Boston 200 camels from Tao Deni to Timbuktu, covering 800 kilometers in 40 days amid 150 degrees Celsius heat. Each 40 kg slab is hand-quarried from 15-meter pits and sold in Timbuktu. In 1910, crews carved a 10-kilometer tunnel through the Rocky Mountains using 40-kilogram pneumatic drills that struck about 1,000 times each minute. Noise neared 120 decibels, and fine quartz dust later pushed lawmakers to create early work safety rules. Underwater workers cut the hull of the steamship Eastland at a depth of 9 meters in the Chicago River in 1925. The ship had rolled over beside the pier in 1915 in about 2 minutes after a crowd shifted to one side. At 8,200 meters in an ice cave, the 1924 team faced minus 40 degrees Celsius, 100-kilometer winds, and air with about one-third the oxygen of sea level. Above 8,000 meters, the body breaks down fast without extra oxygen. In January 1938 on the Colima River, forced workers panned for gold in minus 50 degrees Celsius for 14 hours with bare hands because gloves were banned to stop gold loss. This frozen basin produced hundreds of tons of gold. German engineers dropped an 80-meter span in about 3 seconds to slow armor for 2 days on the Seine in 1944. More than 5,000 bridges in France were destroyed during the retreat, yet a failed blast at Remagen let 25,000 cross the Rhine in one day. On May 6, 1937, the giant airship Hindenburg, 245 meters long and filled with about 200,000 cubic meters of hydrogen, caught fire and fell in 34 seconds. On April 20, 1961, Harold Graham made the first free rocket belt flight over Niagara Lake, traveling 112 meters in 21 seconds at about 4.5 meters high. The 57-kilogram pack used hydrogen peroxide that became hot steam near 740 degrees Celsius. On October 7, 1892, German scientist Max von Pettenkofer drank a glass with about 1 billion live cholera bacteria to challenge Robert Koch and germ theory. In May 1986, teams stepped into the broken Unit 4 at Chernobyl for 90-second shifts, where radiation was near 20,000 Roentgen per hour. They pushed graphite back into the core after robots failed. From 1964 to 1968, teams moved an 820-ton statue of Ramses II on rails while the Abu Simbel Temple was cut into 1,036 blocks and rebuilt 65 meters higher and 200 meters back. On March 17, 1959, the submarine USS Skate became the first to surface at the North Pole, breaking about 90 centimeters of ice in minus 40 degrees Celsius. The crew held a brief ceremony on the ice, and the voyage showed 12 days of under-ice travel, using oxygen from water. In 1918 in France, nurses in gas masks treated soldiers exposed to mustard agent at a field hospital. This slow-acting agent harms skin and lungs hours after contact, and outrage over it helped drive the Geneva Protocol ban in 1925. On February 1, 1851, inventor Wilhelm Bauer tested his Brandtalker in Kiel when the craft took on water and settled 16 meters down with 3 men inside. They balanced the pressure by letting water in, opened the hatch. During the Meiji era in the 1860s and 1870s, an anti-Buddhist campaign shut many temples and sent bronze statues to foundries as leaders pushed Shinto and fast change. This great Buddha survived when townspeople formed human chains and stopped 3 removal attempts. Paris, 1925. A showman crossed the Seine on 2 small inflatable pontoons, steering with hand paddles as a crowd watched. One of many bold tests of personal float gear in that era, it hinted at later boards and water gadgets. In Victorian Britain, child chimney sweeps crawled through 7-inch flues that adults could not enter, and long exposure to soot caused serious lifelong harm. Deep beneath Nica in Mexico, the Cave of Crystals holds the largest natural crystals on Earth, grown for hundreds of thousands of years in 136-degree water. Discovered by miners in 2000 about 1,000 feet down. The Willamette meteorite, about 34,200 pounds, fell roughly 13,000 years ago and held rain pools used in cleansing rites by the Clackamas people. Moved by horse teams in 1902 and later sold to the American Museum of Natural History. Giant sequoias can live over 3,000 years and reach about 311 feet tall, the largest trees by volume on Earth. By 1920, most groves were cut, and many huge trunks broke apart when they hit the ground, a loss that helped spark the move to protect the last giants. On May 8, 1902, Mount Pelée hurled a scorching cloud that rushed at about 100 miles per hour and stilled St. Pierre in under 2 minutes. One man, Auguste Cypris, lived because his stone cell had a tiny window underground. On April 14, 1935, Black Sunday turned day to night as winds lifted millions of tons of soil and carried it far across the country. Years of drought and broken prairie grass set the stage, and the disaster led to new soil care programs that changed farming. In the 1530s, under Henry VIII, the scavenger's daughter compressed the body into a tight ball, the opposite of the rack that stretched people. Public backlash and new laws led England to bar such practices in 1640. The Berezovka mammoth was found with bits of buttercups and grass still in its mouth and stomach, a last meal from about 44,000 years ago. Frozen within hours after a fall, its meat was so well kept that sled dogs could eat it. Guests dined on fine china, slept in warm cabins, and heard a light aluminum piano while clouds drifted past the windows. A sealed smoking room with an electric lighter kept hydrogen out, a calm ritual on a gas-filled giant that made 63 ocean crossings before its last flight in May 1937. Kayan women start wearing brass neck coils in childhood, and the weight pushes the shoulders and ribs down, so the neck only looks longer. Today, a small community in Myanmar and Thailand keeps the tradition for culture and visitor income. In 1881, Yosemite's Wawana tunnel tree was cut with an 8-foot passage for stagecoaches and still stood until a heavy snow in 1969. Redwoods carry life in a thin outer layer, so even hollow giants can grow. True albino alligators are about 1 in 20,000 births, with pink eyes and very poor daylight vision, so most live in care rather than the wild. Only a few hundred exist worldwide, and their pale skin needs shade and gentle handling. The Utica crib was sold as a kind restraint, yet people lay inside for days and often develop sores, lung illness, and deep despair. After reporter Nellie Bly exposed asylum life in the late 1880s, new rules slowly reduced the use of such devices. In 1952, the first full-scale hydrogen device, Ivy Mike, erased a small Pacific island and left a crater about 1 mile wide filled with seawater. Its flash was seen from far away, and the fallout spread around the world, marking the start of the fusion age. By the 1860s, demand for artificial arms led makers to build spring and pulley hands with finger joints moved by shoulder straps. By the 1880s, some could write, eat, and switch many grips. Eugen Sandow, the showman who shaped modern bodybuilding, could bend steel and raise 300-pound weights, and he even performed for Queen Victoria. His classic shape, 48-inch chest, 30-inch waist, 18-inch arms. Graf Zeppelin's skin was a cotton sheet about 0.2 millimeters thick, yet crew walked on it in flight to glue patches while winds topped 60 miles per hour. Over 590 flights and 1.7 million miles, it carried 13,000 people with a perfect passenger safety record. In a winter storm on December 28, 1879, the Tay Bridge gave way under a train in winds near 70 miles per hour, and no passengers survived. Investigators found weak wind bracing and cracked cast iron hidden with wax and paint. By 1900, crews cut lake ice in deep cold and stored it with sawdust, moving about 25 million tons each year. Blocks sailed for months to India and Australia, with a third still frozen on arrival. But electric cooling in the 1920s ended the trade within 30 years. From 1923 to 1929, giant concrete arrows with beacon towers pointed the way across the country, each one guiding pilots to the next 10 miles ahead. Following these sky marks, early airmail routes proved long-distance flight could work. Giants like this can live for more than 3,000 years, moving water in a thin 2-inch skin, so even a mostly hollow trunk keeps growing. General Sherman holds about 52,000 cubic feet of wood, yet adds fresh growth each year and lifts hundreds of gallons to its crown. At the Paris Opera in 1884, a performer wore an electric light dress with about 100 bulbs, powered by a 30-pound battery that could shine for roughly 3 hours. Waterspouts are tornado-like vortices over warm water, often rising 3,000 to 5,000 feet and spinning at over 100 miles per hour, strong enough to lift fish and frogs that later fall as animal rain. They can form from calm water to a full funnel in about 60 seconds. From 1922 into the 1940s, London's Chelsea Baby Club loaned window-mounted baby cages so apartment families could give infants sun and fresh air, bolting the wire boxes to sills for 1 to 2 hours even in rain or snow. In 1875, a cloud of Rocky Mountain locusts, about 12.5 trillion insects, darkened the noon sky over 198,000 square miles, stripping fields bare and even stopping trains as crushed bodies made the rails slick. Within a single generation, the species vanished by 1902, likely because new farms disturbed its river. Megalodon hit about 60 feet and 50 tons, with roughly 276 teeth in 5 rows. Individual teeth grew to 7 inches, and a mottled bite near 40,000 pounds could crack whale bones with ease. It disappeared around 3.6–2.6 million years ago as oceans cooled and prey shifted. In January 1919, a giant tank burst in Boston and sent a 5 meters wave of molasses racing at 56 kilometers per hour. Cold air made the syrup thick like wet cement, and crews blasted it with seawater for days as the smell lingered for years. An early psychiatry device called the spinning chair promised calm by rotating the body dozens of times per minute to rebalance blood in the brain. Many hospitals used chairs like this in the 1800s and early 1900s until science replaced them with gentler care. Julia Pastrana was born in Mexico in 1834 with a rare condition that covered most of her face and body with hair. She spoke 3 languages and sang opera. Her story traveled the world for more than a century before she finally came home to Mexico in 2013. From 1930 to 1936, giant dust storms stripped the Great Plains and sent 2.5 million people on the road. Farm plowing removed deep grass roots, so when drought came, the wind lifted the soil into black skies. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne held Bastogne in deep snow with little food, little heat, and almost no winter gear. When asked to surrender, their commander sent one word, "Nuts," and days later, a relief force broke through. Raised from a shipwreck near a Greek island in 1901, the Antikythera mechanism is a 2,100-year-old analog computer that predicted the sun, the moon, the planets, and eclipses. It holds 37 bronze gears. In July 1918, the last Russian imperial family met their end in a small basement room, and jewels sewn into dresses even acted like thin armor. Their hidden graves were found many years later, and genetic tests confirmed the story. From 1890 to 1914, riding a bicycle in trousers became a clear sign of women seeking freedom. By 1900, women owned about 1/3 of all bicycles, and leaders said the bicycle did more for emancipation than anything else. On May 6, 1937, the airship Hindenburg burst into flame and fell in 34 seconds as a radio voice cried, "Oh, the humanity!" Helium was withheld, so it used hydrogen, and the first spark is still debated from static to a flammable skin. In 1890 on Mulberry Street, New York newsboys curled up in cellar doors and used newspapers as blankets. Photos like this by Jacob Riis pushed the city to improve housing and create shelters for children. In the 1920s, Al Capone was photographed living in comfort inside a county jail, with rugs, a radio, and a personal cook, which sparked a scandal. He was later convicted for unpaid taxes, and by the late 1930s, illness had quietly ended his power. Before dawn on April 15, 1912, the ship Carpathia reached drifting lifeboats and took aboard 706 survivors among small ice fields. Many seats had been left empty when the liner sank, so rescue boats returned to pick up a few more as the sea fell silent. General Tom Thumb, born Charles Stratton, stood 102 centimeters yet filled grand halls worldwide and earned $50,000 a year in the 1840s. His wedding in 1863 to Lavinia Warren drew thousands. On October 4, 1957, Sputnik 1, a metal sphere 58 centimeters wide, orbited Earth every 96 minutes and sent a simple beep on 20.005 megahertz that people heard around the world. That sound began the space age. During the Cold War, about 200,000 American families built small backyard shelters with food, water, radios, and a Geiger counter. After the crisis of 1962, sales soared, and many of those rooms later became wine cellars or quiet time capsules. On June 6, 1944, Robert Capa landed with the first wave on Omaha Beach and shot 106 frames under fire in 90 minutes. A lab error melted most of the film, leaving 11 blurred images that became the defining view of the landing. In 1947, a 15-year-old shepherd tossed a stone into a cave near Qumran and found jars with 2,000-year-old scrolls. These Hebrew and Aramaic texts include Isaiah and match modern Bibles, almost word for word, changing how we study early faiths. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European powers drew borders for Africa without a single African at the table. Straight lines hundreds of kilometers long split more than 190 peoples across new colonies, shaping many later conflicts. On February 12, 1947, Christian Dior showed the new look with ankle-length skirts about 12 meters around and waists tightened to 46 centimeters. After years of war rationing, the rich fabric revived French style and textiles. In August 1969, about 400,000 people turned a small New York farm into a city, and the festival became free when the fences came down. Despite rain and deep mud, the crowd stayed calm and shared food and blankets. In Australia, police once used neck chains to move Aboriginal people to reserves under strict control. Some of these laws lasted into the 1970s, and families still trace records to understand this past. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, a magnitude 7.9 quake struck San Francisco, split streets, and fires burned for 3 days after the water lines failed. About 225,000 people lost homes. Born in 1868, Myrtle Corbin had a rare double pelvis that gave her 4 legs, and she walked using the outer pair. She married, had 5 children, and later left the stage for a quiet life in Texas. On April 22, 1915, near Ypres, Germany released a chlorine cloud 6 kilometers wide that drifted into the trenches at about 1 kilometer per hour. The heavy gas damaged lungs and marked the first large-scale chemical attack of the war. At the 1904 St. Louis Marathon, chaos ruled. One runner rode 11 miles in a car, the real winner staggered in after being fed strychnine and brandy, and a Cuban postman in cut trousers ate roadside apples and still placed 4th. In 1914, William Longley and Charles Martin made the first color underwater photo by firing a powerful magnesium flash above the sea. The light reached 5 meters and revealed coral colors people had never seen, opening the door to ocean photography. Taken in 1932 at Rockefeller Center, 11 ironworkers eat lunch on a beam about 250 meters above the city, with no safety lines. Many crews were Irish and Mohawk ironworkers, and the photo was likely staged for publicity, even as the height was real. In 1910, Edmond Locard opened the first police science lab in Lyon with a microscope and a bold idea that every contact leaves a trace. That rule turned dust, fibers, and tiny specks into proof and launched modern forensics used worldwide today. In 1898, stampeders climbed the Golden Stairs at Chilkoot Pass, about 1,500 ice steps on a 35-degree slope. Canada required 1 ton of supplies per person, so most made about 33 trips over weeks or months to reach the Yukon. On November 8, 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen found new invisible rays that pass through skin and make bones and rings appear on a screen. His first picture showed his wife's hand, and he refused patents so doctors could use X-rays for care. In 1904, a World's Fair built a Philippine village where 1,100 Filipinos lived on display for millions. It was sold as education to support American rule, with staged native life and body measurements used to shape public opinion. On March 16, 1926, near Auburn, Massachusetts, Robert Goddard launched the first liquid-fueled rocket using gasoline and liquid oxygen. It rose about 41 feet and flew 184 feet in 2.5 seconds. From 1920 to 1933, agents smashed barrels as the law banned making and selling alcohol. Yet hidden bars multiplied, and the city drank in secret. The ban fueled a huge black market and helped build modern organized crime until another amendment ended it 13 years later. From 1931 to 1936, 21,000 workers poured 3.25 million cubic meters of concrete to raise Hoover Dam 221 meters high. Engineers ran 950 kilometers of cooling pipes inside the wall, or else the concrete would have taken 125 years to cool. ENIAC switched on February 14, 1946, 17th of 468 vacuum tubes, 167 square meters, 150 kilowatts, and about 5,000 operations per second. Yet a modern phone is roughly 100 million times faster. A 1912 patent pitched this mobile bath as a commute time saver, but the 200-kilogram tub needed a horse to tow it and splashed water at every bump, so not one unit sold. From 1900 to 1920, examiners logged thousands of whimsical devices that technically worked. In July 1923, a stunt rider on a rigid-frame motorcycle with almost no suspension flew across a canyon before thousands of onlookers and landed clean. Crowds in that era paid $1 to watch these canyon jumpers. On 30th of June 1908, a cosmic airburst over Siberia released an estimated 10 to 15 megatons of energy, flattening 80 million trees across 2,150 square kilometers as pressure waves circled the planet twice and nights in Europe glowed for days. In the 1910s, a coast-to-coast call could take 30 minutes and 3 to 5 operators, each plugging cords by hand for 10 to 12 hours a day on $8 to $12 a week. Firms hired mostly unmarried women ages 18 to 25 under strict rules. 2 short breaks and instant dismissal for rudeness. Built in 1903, this steam bicycle weighed about 150 kilograms and needed 30 minutes to warm up, with a 200-degree boiler by the rider's legs, a top speed near 15 kilometers per hour, and a thirst of about 20 liters of water per kilometer. In 1918, a blizzard buried New York City under 30 inches in 24 hours, with 80-kilometer-per-hour winds stacking snow to second-floor windows and freezing the streets in place. Crews even used dynamite to crack the ice walls. By 1920, the Lower East Side teamed with 80,000 pushcart vendors, most earning $2 to $5 a week, working 14 to 16 hours a day, and facing $50 licenses that often led to goods being seized. Many slept under their carts and turned hustle into retail skills. Westinghouse-era steam turbines weighed about 500 to 800 tons, produced 5 to 25 megawatts, enough power for a city of 50,000, and took 6 to 12 months and over 200 specialists to build, costing $500,000 to $1 million, about $15 to $30 million today. Tri-State Tornado, March 18, 1925, raced 219 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana at about 60 miles per hour, leveling whole towns and causing the highest tornado loss of life in United States history. Victorian-era dentistry often relied on restraints, head clamps, and bite blocks because reliable pain control was limited and not yet routine, so visits were tense and loud rather than gentle. In 1908, Kansas saw a locust cloud darken midday, spanning about 5,000 square kilometers. Trillions of insects stripped up to 80% of the wheat in a single day as the wing-beat roar carried for miles. Early drivers in 1900 to 1915 often spent about 40% of their time fixing cars. Engines overheated every few dozen kilometers, tires punctured daily, and a full overhaul was due by around 8,000 kilometers. In 1920, police made mass arrests of small bootleg sellers, fines were light, and seized barrels often vanished, so organized groups took over the trade within 2 years. By 1925, Al Capone controlled most of Chicago's illicit liquor with about $100 million a year. Nickelodeons from 1905 to 1915 ran 10 to 15-minute reels for 5 cents, and by 1910, about 10,000 venues drew 26 million weekly visitors with fresh programs every day. In 1912, 20,000 textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, mostly immigrant women, stopped the mills to demand fair pay and humane hours. After 10 winter weeks of disciplined marches, sending children to host families, and national attention, owners granted raises up to 15%. Doctors in 1918 fought influenza with canvas oxygen hoods, camphor shots, bloodletting, and huge aspirin doses because viruses weren't yet understood. Results were often disappointing, and surprisingly, many healthy young adults were hardest hit by their own overactive immune response. Barnstormers in the 1910s and 1920s walked on wings, hung from struts, and even jumped between planes for $50 to $200 a show, pulling crowds of 10,000 to 50,000 at county fairs. The daredevil craze grew until new federal rules in 1927 required licenses and safety checks. New York built its first subway from 1900 to 1904 using cut-and-cover trenches up to 15 meters deep, uncovering forgotten 17th-century cellars, old wells, and even a hidden river beneath Broadway. When it opened on 27 October 1904, 150,000 rode the first day and 500,000 by week's end. From 1900 to 1932, radium water tonics with real radium 226, about 1 to 2 microcuries per liter, were sold as cure-alls, and daily use let the element settle in bones like calcium. About 70% of U.S. children in 1900 to 1930 learned in one-room schools, with 40 to 60 pupils, ages 6 to 18, taught together by one teacher who often earned $400 to $600 a year. A single big top could seat 10,000 to 15,000 people, span about 2 acres, rise 30 meters, weigh 10 tons, and be raised in 8 hours by 100 to 150 workers before a 60 to 80 car circus train rolled it to the next town overnight. Knocker-uppers woke mill workers in the early morning when alarm clocks were costly and unreliable, tapping windows with long canes or pea shooters for 1 penny per window, and often covering 50 to 100 homes before dawn. Pavlov measured saliva in dogs using small tubes and found that a simple bell, when paired with food, soon caused salivation by itself, the classic conditioned reflex that won him the 1904 Nobel Prize. Endurance dance marathons of the 1920s and 1930s ran 500 to 3,000 hours, with couples getting only a 15-minute break each hour and even dozing upright while still moving to avoid elimination. Before antibiotics, tuberculosis care meant years in mountain sanatoriums. Patients lay on open-air winter terraces at -20 degrees with strict isolation and lung collapse treatments. Yet survival was near 40%. In 1918, the British tested armored elephants with a Maxim gun on top, but the animals panicked at the noise and weight, bolted, and the trials were quietly dropped. The episode shows how trench stalemate pushed wild ideas until tanks proved the only workable mix of armor, tracks, and firepower. On December 6, 1917, the munitions ship Mont Blanc collided in Halifax Harbor, and its fireball detonated with about 2.9 kilotons of energy, flattening districts, sending a harbor wave ashore, and even hurling a 1-ton anchor roughly 4 kilometers. In 1925, 20 mushers and 150 sled dogs rushed antitoxin to Nome, over 1,085 kilometers in 127.5 hours through minus 50 Celsius cold, stopping a dangerous outbreak when planes and trains could not move. Ellis Island could process up to 11,000 arrivals a day with a 6-second medical exam and quick chalk codes, XEEHL, directing anyone who needed further checks. About 2% were refused after selling everything to cross the ocean, separating families. Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, saw a wall of dust about 100 meters tall and 300 kilometers wide race across the plains at roughly 100 kilometers per hour, turning afternoon into midnight in minutes. Auguste Piccard rose in a sealed steel sphere under a hydrogen balloon to about 16,940 meters in May 27, 1933, seeing a dark daytime sky and the curve of Earth while measuring cosmic rays. In 1921 at Blair Mountain, about 10,000 coal miners confronted 3,000 company-backed forces in a 5-day showdown so intense that aircraft were used against the marchers, the largest worker uprising in U.S. history. At peak summer weekends in the 1920s, Coney Island drew about 1 million visitors, 150,000 on the sand at once, trains every 2 minutes, hour-long lines for the cyclone, and 20,000 people in the water. Fueled by the new 40-hour work week and 25-cent thrills, it became mass leisure's showcase where bankers and steelworkers queued together. On September 3, 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed a clear ring around a stray penicillium mold on his staphylococcus plate. The mold was making a substance that stopped the bacteria, which he named penicillin. In 1913, Charles Taylor turned a Curtiss biplane into a full airborne tailor shop, foot-powered sewing machine, mannequin, and fabric racks bolted in, adding about 350 kilograms and requiring a 150 horsepower engine. In 1943 to 1945, about 20 million American households planted victory gardens, growing roughly 40% of the nation's vegetables and saving around $300 per family. Women ran assembly lines by day and tended plots at night, proving they could do every job men did. The photo shows Gandhi's 1930 Salt March. After a 240-mile walk to the sea, marchers lifted a handful of salt to challenge the British tax and monopoly, and tens of thousands were peacefully jailed. That small pinch cut into imperial revenue and proved that nonviolent action could shake an empire. An inventor in 1906 sold a spring-loaded automatic hat lifter that raised a top hat when a gentleman bowed. It cost $8, weighed 2 kilograms, and often gave headaches while taking 2 seconds to do what a hand does in half a second. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery for refusing to give up her seat. Fined $14, she spent a day in jail and triggered a 381-day bus boycott as 40,000 residents walked to work. On May 20, 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis solo across the Atlantic in 33.5 hours with 0 sleep after 55 awake, skimming just above the waves to stay alert, eating 5 sandwiches, and even using a bottle because there was no restroom. On May 29, 1953 at 11:30 in the morning, Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary reached the top of Everest, stayed about 15 minutes as oxygen ran low, and Hillary took the only summit photo of Tenzing. In August 1947, the partition forced about 14 million people to move in a few weeks, with columns stretching for many kilometers and countless lives lost in the chaos. A border drawn in 5 weeks by Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India. In July 1925, teacher John Scopes deliberately tested Tennessee's Butler Act, and the town of Dayton turned the courtroom into a national media show with radio coverage and souvenir stands. He was found guilty and fined $100, later voided. In late October 1956, Budapest students sparked a nationwide uprising that toppled the Soviet-backed cabinet for 13 days and declared neutrality from the Warsaw Pact. Soviet armor returned with about 1,000 tanks. December 14, 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole 34 days before Scott, skiing 30 to 40 kilometers per day with precise depots and Inuit-taught dog teams. All 5 men returned healthy after a 99-day, 3,000-kilometer round trip, and in 1928, Amundsen vanished on an Arctic rescue flight. Founded on September 18, 1947 by the National Security Act, the Central Intelligence Agency grew from the Wartime Office of Strategic Services into a global service with a classified budget and about 21,000 staff. Outnumbered almost 3 to 1 in the summer of 1940, RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, guided by the new radar network and swift ground control, shot down enemy aircraft at roughly a 2 to 1 rate, forcing the planned sea invasion to be called off. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, a magnitude 7.9 quake snapped gas lines and crippled water mains, letting urban fires rage for 4 days and erase 25,000 buildings. Up to 10,000 lives were lost and 250,000 people displaced. In 1889, surgeon William Halstead asked Goodyear to make rubber gloves to protect Nurse Caroline Hampton's hands from harsh antiseptics. Infections fell sharply, and he later married her. Few knew the famed pioneer quietly battled a lifelong dependence sparked by self-testing early anesthetics. March 1947, Christian Dior unveils the new look in Paris: pinched waist, padded hips, and a sweeping 30-yard skirt that instantly reset style after years of fabric rationing. Editors ordered on the spot, and within a year, the silhouette revived French couture exports and made Dior. Seen alive on June 8, 1924, near 8,600 meters, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine pushed into cloud toward the summit and then vanished. Mallory's remains were found in 1999 with a snapped rope and no camera, leaving the enduring mystery of whether they reached the top decades before 1953. The 1906 Athens Intercalated Games brought 20 nations and 884 athletes, but decades later, the IOC erased them from official records, so their 78 medals do not count. Tug of war was an Olympic event from 1900 to 1920. Teams of 8 won by pulling 6 feet. Allied aircraft struck Dresden on 13 to 15 February 1945 with about 1,300 bombers, dropping roughly 3,900 tons of munitions that created a firestorm and leveled much of the historic center. After the Meiji Sword Ban of 1876, Japan dissolved the samurai estate. About 400,000 men lost stipends and status overnight as railways, factories, and offices replaced feudal service. Saigo Takamori's Satsuma Rebellion in 1877 was their last act. In November 1923, a failed beer hall power grab in Munich ended within 16 hours when police stopped the march. 16 followers died, and the party leader was arrested with a broken shoulder. In court, he turned the trial into publicity, served 9 months writing his manifesto. From October 1934 to October 1935, about 86,000 Red Army soldiers trekked roughly 9,600 kilometers across 18 mountain ranges and 24 rivers. After 368 days, only about 1 in 10 reached the new base. On July 24, 1908, Dorando Pietri staggered into the London Olympic Stadium, ran the wrong way, fell 5 times in the last 350 meters, was turned and helped to the line, and was then disqualified, so the gold went to American Johnny Hayes. On June 4, 1913, suffragette Emily Davison stepped onto the Epsom Derby track and reached for the King's horse to attach a ribbon. She was struck, was badly hurt, and passed away 4 days later, becoming a rallying symbol seen by millions in newsreels. In September 14 to 22, 1922, the port city of Smyrna was consumed by fire after Turkish forces took control, leaving more than 100,000 people trapped on the quay while Allied ships held to neutrality in the harbor. Laika launched on November 3, 1957, as the first animal to orbit Earth. The mission had no return plan, and declassified records later showed she succumbed to overheating within a few hours. The Statue of Liberty arrived from France in 214 crates with 350 pieces and was assembled in 4 months after Joseph Pulitzer's readers crowdfunded the pedestal with 120,000 small gifts, averaging 83 cents. London's 1948 Austerity Olympics had no village. Athletes slept in barracks and school dorms, ate ration book meals, and competed in a stadium repaired up to the last minute. With Germany and Japan excluded and the Soviet Union absent. On April 13, 1904, the Russian battleship Petropavlovsk struck a Japanese mine near Port Arthur and sank in 2 minutes with Admiral Stepan Makarov and most of her crew. The shock weakened Russian morale and foreshadowed defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. In Easter 1916, about 1,200 Irish volunteers seized Dublin's General Post Office and declared a republic. Britain rushed in roughly 20,000 troops with artillery, and the garrison surrendered after 6 days. In October 1962, Soviet sub B-59 was harassed by U.S. ships. The captain and political officer voted to fire a nuclear torpedo, but Vasily Arkhipov refused, and unanimity was required. Declassified files show 162 warheads were already on Cuba, and local commanders had launch authority. So his single no likely kept a regional clash from becoming global. Stonewall, June 28, 1969. A routine police raid flipped into 6 nights of street resistance, and 1 year later, the first Pride marches. Led by patrons including Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, no matter who threw the first object, they're organizing after the clash built support groups. On December 28, 1895, the Lumiere brothers ran the first paid movie show in Paris. 10 shorts of about 50 seconds each, 33 people paying 1 franc, and the famous arrival of a train reportedly made viewers flinch as if it would burst from the screen. The 1964 Kitty Genovese case became legend after a New York Times story said 38 witnesses watched for 30 minutes, but later reviews showed 2 separate attacks, at least 2 people called police, and the headline number was largely false. The Food and Drug Administration approved the first birth control pill, Enovid, on May 9, 1960. Within 5 years, about 6.5 million American women used it, gaining new control over timing of pregnancy and fueling the social changes of the 1960s. In October 1884, delegates from 25 nations voted 22-1 to make Greenwich the world's prime meridian, beating Paris, though France stubbornly kept Paris mean time until 1911. Other ideas floated from Jerusalem and the Great Pyramid to a neutral Atlantic line. In November 1902, after President Theodore Roosevelt refused to harm a captured bear cub, D.C. shopkeeper Morris Mechtam asked to use the name Teddy's Bear, and the toy exploded in popularity, about 1 million sold in the first year. Dartmouth, May 1, 1964. Professors John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz unveiled BASIC with plain English commands and time-sharing, letting any student write programs in minutes. Released freely, BASIC spread across campuses, jump-started the personal computer wave, and powered Microsoft's very first product,